In this episode, we're going to take a topic that can feel abstract at first and turn it into something concrete. Auditing a cloud environment in a way that produces trustworthy findings and clear next steps. When people hear the word audit, they often imagine a stressful inspection or a thick report full of scary language. But the core idea is simpler than that. An audit is a structured way to check whether the environment matches the security expectations you claim to follow, and whether those expectations are actually being met in practice. In cloud settings, audits matter because change happens fast, and small configuration choices can quietly introduce big risk. Benchmark tools help you examine the environment against a known baseline, while compliance lenses help you interpret what the findings mean for requirements, accountability, and evidence. By the end, you should be able to explain what a benchmark-driven audit is trying to accomplish, why compliance thinking changes how you frame the work, and how to avoid common beginner mistakes that lead to useless results. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A helpful first step is understanding what we mean by benchmark tools in this context, because the word benchmark can be misunderstood. Here, a benchmark is a published set of security checks that describe what good looks like for a particular kind of cloud account, service, or configuration area. These checks might focus on identity settings, logging, networking exposure, storage access rules, encryption defaults, and many other categories that commonly produce real-world incidents. Benchmark tools are the practical way to apply those checks at scale because they can compare large sets of settings against the benchmark and highlight where the environment diverges. The value is consistency, because two auditors using the same benchmark should reach similar conclusions about what is configured well and what is not. For an exam, it's important to recognize that benchmark tools are not magical, and they do not replace judgment, but they do provide repeatable measurements that make audits more objective. They turn complicated environments into a list of findings that you can reason about. Compliance lenses are the second half of the title, and they change the goal from merely finding technical issues to producing evidence that maps to expectations and requirements. A compliance lens is the perspective you apply when you interpret findings in terms of obligations, like internal policies, contracts, or regulations, rather than only in terms of engineering preferences. In cloud audits, this matters because the same technical issue can have different meaning depending on the requirement you must meet. For example, missing logs might be an inconvenience for troubleshooting in one organization, but a serious control failure in another if they must prove accountability and traceability. Compliance thinking also forces you to be specific about scope, ownership, and documentation, because evidence must show what was checked, when it was checked, and who is responsible for fixing issues. Beginners sometimes treat compliance as a separate world from security, but in practice, compliance is often the language that gets security funded and enforced. A strong auditor can speak both languages without confusing them. To audit well, you need to be clear about what you are auditing, because cloud environments can be huge and constantly changing. Scope is the boundary that defines which accounts, subscriptions, projects, regions, and services are included in the audit. Without a clear scope, you can end up with findings that are incomplete, misleading, or impossible to act on, because nobody knows whether the audit covered the critical areas. Scope also includes the time window and the data sources, because audits rely on evidence that can change from day to day. For example, checking configuration settings is different from checking activity records, and both might be needed to understand whether a control exists and whether it is used. A scope statement does not need to be complicated, but it must be precise enough that another person could repeat the audit later and compare results. That repeatability is a major reason benchmark tools are used, because they help you capture the same measurements across time. Once scope is clear, the next idea is control objectives, which are the outcomes you want the environment to achieve from a security standpoint. A control objective might be that only authorized identities can access sensitive data, that all administrative actions are logged, or that public exposure is minimized by default. Benchmark checks often map to these objectives, but not always perfectly, so you should avoid treating the benchmark as the objective itself. A benchmark check might say a certain feature should be enabled, but the deeper question is why it matters and what risk it reduces. Compliance lenses also map to objectives, because requirements often describe desired outcomes like confidentiality, integrity, availability, and accountability, even if they do not use those exact words. When you connect a benchmark finding to a control objective, you make the result meaningful rather than just a list of failed checks. Meaning is what turns an audit from a paperwork exercise into a security improvement tool. A common beginner mistake is confusing configuration presence with control effectiveness, because benchmarks often focus on whether settings are enabled. For example, an audit might show that logging is turned on, but that does not automatically mean the organization can actually use those logs during an incident. Logs might be stored for too short a time, might be missing key events, or might be spread across places that nobody monitors. Another example is multi-factor authentication, where a setting can appear enabled, yet exceptions, legacy flows, or poorly scoped access rules might leave gaps. Benchmark tools help you detect obvious misconfigurations, but they may not fully reveal how controls behave in real situations. That is why auditors often supplement benchmark outputs with reasoning about workflows, access paths, and evidence quality. On the exam, you want to show that you understand the difference between a checkbox and a control that can be defended. Another important concept is normalization, which in this context means turning raw benchmark results into a consistent format that supports comparison and prioritization. Benchmark tools can generate many findings, and if you treat them all as equal, you will overwhelm the people who need to fix them. Normalization includes describing each finding with consistent fields, such as what resource is affected, what the benchmark expected, what the environment currently has, and what risk that difference introduces. It also includes categorizing findings so you can see patterns, like whether most issues relate to identity, logging, network exposure, or storage access. Compliance lenses benefit from normalization because evidence needs structure, not scattered notes. A structured output also helps when audits are repeated because you can track whether findings were resolved, whether new ones appeared, and whether risk is trending up or down. For beginners, this is the moment to realize that auditing is not just discovery, but also communication. Evidence quality is a big part of audit credibility, and it is where benchmark tools and compliance thinking intersect. Evidence is not only the finding itself, but the supporting information that proves the finding is real and that someone could verify it later. In cloud audits, good evidence might include resource identifiers, timestamps, and the exact setting values that triggered a benchmark failure. The point is not to bury people in details, but to make each finding defensible and actionable. Poor evidence leads to arguments like, that must be a tool bug, or we already fixed that, or that setting doesn't matter here, and those arguments can stall remediation. With a compliance lens, evidence also has to show coverage, meaning you can demonstrate that the audit examined the relevant systems rather than sampling randomly without justification. When your evidence is solid, the audit becomes less about debating reality and more about deciding what to do next. You also need to understand false positives and context exceptions, because benchmark tools are designed for general best practices, not for every unique environment. A benchmark might flag something that is technically unusual but justified by a documented business need and compensating controls. The key is that exceptions should be explicit, reviewed, and supported by evidence, not accidental and forgotten. Beginners sometimes respond to exceptions by ignoring benchmark results entirely, which is a mistake, because the benchmark still helps you ask the right questions. The more mature approach is to record the exception, explain why it exists, and verify that the compensating controls are real and maintained. Compliance lenses push you toward that maturity because auditors and regulators care about documented decisions, not undocumented improvisation. In exam terms, the safest reasoning is that deviations must be justified and controlled, not simply assumed to be acceptable. Another common challenge is shared responsibility, because cloud audits often require separating what the cloud provider manages from what the customer configures. Benchmark tools can sometimes blur this line by presenting checks as if the customer controls everything, but you must interpret them carefully. The customer is generally responsible for identity management, access control choices, data classification, and configuration of services, while the provider is responsible for the underlying infrastructure and some managed service components. A compliance lens helps here because requirements usually apply to the customer's responsibility, and the audit should focus on what the customer can control and prove. This does not mean ignoring provider assurances, but it does mean being clear about what evidence you can collect from your own environment. A strong audit narrative distinguishes between provider guarantees and customer configuration, so that findings are fair and actionable. That clarity prevents the audit from turning into vague blame or unrealistic expectations. Risk framing is the step that turns benchmark results into priorities, because not every failed check has the same impact. A benchmark might treat two issues similarly, while in your environment one is far more dangerous due to exposure, data sensitivity, or access patterns. For example, a misconfiguration on an internet-facing service is often more urgent than a similar misconfiguration on a tightly isolated internal service. A compliance lens can also affect priority, because some requirements carry heavier consequences if violated, even if the technical risk seems moderate. Good auditors avoid a one-size-fits-all severity label and instead explain why the issue matters in terms of likelihood and impact. This helps decision-makers understand why certain fixes should happen first, and it helps engineering teams focus their effort. On an exam, you often need to choose answers that reflect risk-based prioritization rather than blindly fixing everything in benchmark order. Finally, a benchmark-driven audit should produce a results story that is coherent, not just a spreadsheet of failures. The story includes what scope was audited, what benchmark baseline was used, what the biggest themes were, and what those themes imply about the environment's security posture. It also includes how the findings map to requirements and control objectives, so the audit can support governance and decision-making. Beginners sometimes stop at the point of finding problems, but the real value is translating problems into a plan. What needs to be fixed, who owns it, what evidence will prove it is fixed, and how you will prevent the problem from returning. Benchmark tools provide the measurement engine, and compliance lenses provide the interpretation framework, and together they create an audit that survives scrutiny. If you can explain these concepts clearly, you will be prepared for exam questions that test auditing logic, and you will also have a practical mental model for how cloud audits should work in real organizations.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.